I want to welcome all of you. I'm impressed by the number that we have both in person and virtually, since this is our J term and we don't have our regular contingent of staff and students. In fact, a number of our faculty, CNS staff are teaching in Vermont at the moment or in Prague for our reactor course. But I think it is a function of our speaker here, Dr. Adam Stulberg, which kind of draws this particularly large crowd. So I've printed out just to kind of refresh my own memory about how long ago it was when Adam and I were both together at UCLA. And I'm not going to mention the year because it kind of dates, both of us. But what many of you may not know is that Dr. Stulberg actually served as a senior research associate at CNS in 1997 to 98. And I'm not going to bore you with all of our connections, but it goes back, not personally, but familiar-wise over a century to a small village in Ukraine. And then we kind of, University of Michigan, UCLA, the Nunn School, everything is kind of linked here. So I feel a particular affinity, to Adam, and it's always a great pleasure to welcome him back. I think, as many of you know, Adam is the Sam Nunn Professor and Chair at the Sam Nunn School of International Affairs at Georgia Tech University. He has a very diverse background, which certainly includes the post-Soviet space, energy policy, AI, and is one of the leading scholars in a number of fields, which I think is also indicated by the fact that I don't think I know anybody else who has received 3 Minerva Awards, two at one time and then another one recently, which focuses on data analytics. So I think what you will hear today is a connection among his work on Russian issues, his work in the data analytics sector, and probably a lot more. So without saying more, Adam, it's just a great pleasure to welcome you back to CNS.
Well, thanks, Bill, and thanks, everybody. I see a lot of familiar faces, both in person and online. And I also want to make sure that everybody understands that this is a product of research that I've been working very closely with a colleague from the Hague Center for Strategic Studies, Stefan Spigliera, who he and I were both lowly grad students when Bill was building this idea of a non-proliferation project at UCLA. And so, as Bill mentioned, we went way back, but same with my colleague and my collaborator here. And so what I'm going to talk to you about today represents an effort that we've been making in trying to integrate data analytics into understanding great power politics as well as nuclear escalation or issues related to escalation and conflict. And it grows out of several sponsored research efforts, one by the Department of Defense that Bill mentioned, another one also by the Carnegie Corporation of New York. So I want to make sure that I acknowledge the support there. But of course, all of these musings and applications are the fault of my own. And so please don't take it out on any of the others. But what I want to do is give you a sample of some of the research we've been doing, and I'll be happy to talk in more depth about the particular issue because I know we have a wide range of audiences that are different, people coming from different parts. And let me just also preface this by saying my remarks in this collaborative effort, that is designed to bringing data and visual analytics to the party of social science approaches to understanding the great power competition. I have come to this as more on the social science side and originally very skeptical about applying a lot of these tools. But I've come to appreciate it in a certain context, and that's what I'll hope to show you. But I'm open to having a conversation by this. I'm not a part of the true believer crowd in any context. I'm happy to engage in all conversation. But I do think that as someone who directs a School of International Affairs, I'm very keen to have the next generation really appreciate and think critically about the role of computational social science. And so this is a foray into that. And so without further ado, let me turn to the substance at hand, which is really trying to understand Putin's red lines rhetoric and putting it into the context of how do we understand issues of escalation. And I don't need to remind everybody here, but Putin's war of choice or war of aggression in Ukraine has been fought under the shadow of great power competition and the escalation of nuclear war. And that said, much of the attention has been devoted to trying to understand Putin's red lines, because actually, as this image captures, there's been a lot of confusion and a lot of different ways of using red lines. And actually, caught everybody off guard is that Putin really, and before even calling this a special military operation, began to issue red lines. And very early on in the conflict and very often, they were highly escalatory, very conspicuous, using the terms in Russian explicitly, but also using them literally, explicitly, and implicitly throughout the conflict and the war. The rhetoric that he has articulated has been picked up by others. Medvedev, of course, the foreign minister, others in the presidential administration, as well as analysts there. There's been a parallel rhetoric about nuclear threats going on at the same time. Many in the West have equated those as one and the same. But notwithstanding the early and often and incendiary rhetoric coming out of the Kremlin, there's actually been a rather conspicuous gap between the rhetoric and actual escalatory follow-through, if you will, of that rhetoric. And then most recently, that the crazy lines, the incoherent lines that were captured on that slide have begun to become more coherent in the last 4 or 5 months. So this is the backdrop of what we're trying to explicate, and we're trying to make sense out of this. But when you think about the red lines, it raises a whole host of questions. What do they mean? You know, how clear are they? How frequent are they? Have they been articulated? What are the red lines? What is the line? What is the consequence? What is it correlated with in terms of precipitating international events or follow through from the articulation? Do the red line threats jibe with the strategies of escalation that we're used to thinking about, especially in the deterrence context? Is it consistent with the different models that we think about in terms of the classic deterrence theory or the threat that leaves something to chance logic? Or is there something else going on? And then, of course, what are the strategic consequences of challenging or not challenging this rhetoric? That's sort of what animates the research. And so what we've been doing over the last year and a half is try to explicate that macro puzzle and answer those specific questions, and doing so in through three prisms. One is to sort of understand what is actually being articulated. What is the content of the discourse about red lines? The second one has to do with the context of the red lines. What is the strategic context? In other words, what is going on? What are there? Does the frequency and the intensity of this threat discourse correlate with particular actions that Ukraine's taking on the operational plane versus the West on the strategic plane? And then the third lens is, what is the conceptual coherence around the content and the strategic context? What is the strategy that is reflected by this discourse? Does it reflect this sort of threat that leaves something to chance or classic deterrence theory? Or, those who study Russia, is it something else, rooted in the way that they think about what they call strategic deterrence? And is it one or the other, or a little bit of everything? What does that mean? So let me cut to the chase, because what I'll probably do is give you a sense of how we approach these problems, give you some of the findings, give you a flavor of what we do, and then probably have a question answer. So I want to make sure that at minimum you understand where our research is falling. One is that our conversation about red lines and what Russia is doing is talking past what Putin is articulating. I think there's like two trains that are passing in the night, if you will. And then when we look more specifically at the red line discourse, and especially Putin's red line discourse, we see a conspicuous, if not purposeful, opacity around it. Not just in terms of what the lines are, or the consequences are, but where the lines actually are. And there's no correlation between external events, no clear and consistent correlation between the patterns of the articulation in terms of frequency and intensity of the red line threats and external action, such as overall events, aggressiveness by the West, or particular military assistance, lethal military assistance provided by the West, or even drone strikes by Ukrainians. And I'll give you a flavor of that. So we don't see any clear external correlation with this. We also, on the other hand, see, as I mentioned, almost a purposeful opacity around this, which is very consistent with the broader Russian, Soviet, pre-Soviet thinking about reflexive control, which is a combination of what we think about coercion, containment, and influence. And I'll talk a little bit about that. So we see that there's a different coherence behind that. And that is different than the threat that leaves something to chance and a lot of the escalatory models that we have. But notwithstanding the different strategic logic and the absence of clear correlations between specific actions by the West or Ukraine, I would argue that we are not out of the woods, and that the real risk of escalation is inadvertent escalation. It's the fact that we don't quite understand each other, yet we think we do. And that's what I would argue is the real risk here. But so this is sort of the bottom line of our research, and we'll try to unpack some of that in the few minutes that we have left, and then I'll be happy to answer other questions along the way. So what I would like to do is, and I won't go into very much detail about the literature on red lines, but I want to make sure everybody understands what red lines are, at least how we're using the concept of red lines, and then talk a little bit about the broader approaches, the empirical approaches that we take, and how we actually process data, and how we are using some of these new tools to extract different patterns in discourse and meshing them with other types of empirical evidence, and then give you some of the findings with respect to the content, context, and coherence that I mentioned before. And then I'll give you a flavor of some of the research that we're doing now, which is really trying to do an empirical, we're calling it forensics or an MRI, to try to identify the strategic principles within the rhetoric using some of these new tools. Okay, so just for those of you, just as a refresher, and I see Jeff and Philip here, and I'm sure you all are, the students are very well steeped in understanding deterrence theory and what red lines are and process of escalation. But in essence, red lines are traditionally seen in the West as a way of making deterrence explicit, right? This is, there's a credibility issue that has to do with deterrence, and red lines are, sort of don't cross this line or else. And this is a way of creating reputational and audience costs by the issuer of deterrence to make it more likely in the eyes of an adversary that you'll follow through on a threat, because you will suffer either international reputation or domestic audience costs of backing down. And so the whole concept of red lines is really rooted in our thinking about deterrence, and primarily about demonstrating or dealing with resolve and credibility types of issues. So obviously, red lines therefore have to have targets. They have to have lines and consequences. There's a progression in the way we think about escalation. There's often this sort of gradual linear notion of escalation that is embedded in the literature. And of course, there, you know, as good scholars, we debate a number of these different issues. And so I don't want to overstate this. There's a debate over whether or not they have to actually be declared, because some things are just taken as a given, such as if you use a nuclear weapon against a country, that it's likely that they're going to respond. So there, you know, Schelling talks about salient threats. So they're also whether or not the red lines are articulated publicly versus privately. There's a debate over that. There's a debate over whether or not there's a window, like how firm the consequences would be, right? There's an argument, especially practitioners talk about the need to maintain some flexibility of the nature of the response. So there's a notion that lines are very explicit, but what happens if you cross the lines is a little bit fuzzy to give some diplomatic flexibility. And some people argue that there's a honeymoon period where if you don't respond immediately, it may signal some restraint that can actually diffuse a situation. So there's some debate over in the literature about what red lines are, but bottom line is success usually surrounds having a clear target, having a clear line, and having significant consequences, but some flexibility in terms of the timing of the follow through. And failure has to do with whether if the lines themselves are arbitrary, they're vague and precise, there's no line, no target, no consequence, and no clear escalatory pathway. So that's what the literature sort of generally tells us. And you sort of, and I won't get into this, but you can map this onto the policy debates over the Putin risk of escalation and red lines. And, you know, generally there are three schools of thought. Let me see if I can go back. There are generally three schools of thought that animate the policy debate. That one, these are hollow threats. There's very little credibility associated with them. There's no link to risk of nuclear escalation, and the recommendation is to sort of stand firm and continue to push and challenge the Russians. There's another one that's rooted in more classic deterrence that says you want to have clear lines, clear consequences, takes the nuclear threat as very consequential and very real. And then there's a sort of the threat that leaves something to chance argument, that targets, lines are very clear, but again, maintaining some ambiguity over consequences to allow for some bargaining and escalatory behavior. So in general, though, most of the literature is challenged by three things, I would argue. One is there's a mirror image. There's a tendency to assume that the Russians are using red lines the same way we use red lines, in particular that credibility and resolve are at the essence of their deterrence approach. And that, you know, and others have pointed to the fact, well, you know, there's a problem of mirror imaging when it comes to ends and means, but there's also a problem of mirror imaging when it comes to ways. In other words, assuming that they're practicing the same logic of deterrence that we are. There's also a notion that these logics are fixed, and that there's one logic that is animating them, as opposed to multiple logics or logics that change over time. And then, of course, empirically, which gets animates both of these issues, very little appreciation for how the adversary talks about deterrence, let alone red lines. And if you look at the literature on the Russian way of war, I saw in Bill's office that he has Dima Adamski's book there, and there are many other scholars of Russian deterrence theory that point out that their concept of war is completely different, that blurs what we think about peace and war, that talks about strategic deterrence, which is a fusion of not only deterrence and compellence on our side, but also containment, manipulation are parts of these things. So these tend to be dismissed or neglected or not integrated into the assessments of these challenges. And of course, the timing of when Putin in particular issues these types of threats. So so there's a problem here, mirror imaging, the static nature of things, and of course not really understanding how the Russians in particular think about these things. So this gets us to the longer term projects that we've been doing, which is really trying to bring data analysis to the picture, and really so that we can have more of a 360 understanding of what's going on in great power competition. In particular, what we do is we try to build different corpora, and there were data agnostic. It could be Russian language corpora, it could be English, it could be Mandarin corpora, it could be by a strategic community, it can be statements by a president, it can be telegram statements. It depends on what you're interested in, what level you want to look at it. But what we do is we sort of build a text strand of the corpora, and we also collect different types of numerical data, that, events data, needs data, conflict data, sanctions data, to try to mesh them, to see if there's any sort of the patterns in the numeric data map with the patterns in the discourse, and using new tools to try to extract these things. And so we draw from a wide range of sources, and most of our work has been looking at Russia and the US, so it's Russian and English language sources, scholarly, and other periodicals. But we've been primarily focusing on the printed, published work, and published also on websites, so not just going through some sort of review process, so statements by people. But we're not looking at social media, although we have begun to. But most of the work, what we're presenting here is not social media driven. And so we develop queries, and we try to extract from the broad literature certain nuggets that we then want to then apply different natural language processing tools to extract either topic models or other types of ways of seeing if there are any correlations in the discourse. And this gives you a sense of what the databases that we've built up over the last couple of years on different topics. That can be on broad conceptual ones like deterrence, or narrower ones like hypersonic systems or MH17. So we have built a wide-ranging set of data sources, and we extract them at the document level, at the paragraph level, at the sentence level, and also what we're doing is chunking things too. So think about a journal article. It has subtitles. We can extract a substance that is longer than a paragraph, but less, and focused on a particular subset. And so we've applied this to deterrence literature. We've also collected a lot on Russian and Chinese discourse, and we can look at different patterns in how the Russians talk about the Chinese talk about the Russians. We've also looked at a lot of sanctions literature, but we have begun to focus, like I said, over the last year and a half on this issue of escalation. And so what we basically are doing is building the corpora. We scrape and this particular exercise is looking specifically at what Putin says. And so we scrape the Kremlin website. We have everything from 2000 till last week. We scrape it twice a week. We store them in a database. We process them in different ways. We disaggregate them, as I mentioned, at different levels. We apply different tools to them, and we've increasingly started to build classifiers. So we've built taxonomies that then provide the basis for an algorithm that we then use with embeddings to go after corpora to try to extract insight. And I'll give you a sense of how we do that. And so with our red lines, what we've done is we have sort of three different corpora that we've come up with. One is when Putin literally uses the terms Krasnaya Linia, Krasnaya Cheta, when he literally uses red lines. We have other corpora that looks at what we call the real red line statements that are explicit threats, but he doesn't actually use the term red lines, but they're tantamount to drawing a line. And then we also have nuclear threat statements, and we've disaggregated that between those that are actual threats of using nuclear weapons versus threats of withdrawing from an arms control treaty, so there are different ways that you can slice and dice these things. But in essence, what we've extracted are 20 literal statements since 2000. 282 of these real red line statements, and 47 nuclear threat statements. And again, this is just by Putin himself, and we've culled this. We've made sure that Putin is the speaker. So if there's an interview, it's not the interviewer that we're picking up, or Macron on the website, but this is actually out of Putin's mouth. And then, like I said, we tried to look at it through three different lenses. So I'll give you a little flavor of this. And so this is actually the corpora on red line that we're pulling from on the Russian officialdom, we call. So it's the website. So we've got about now, this is a little bit data, we're about 13,000 unique documents. But then there's also the Duma, and then we pulled statements by Medvedev. And so we can, we can compare and contrast what Putin's saying versus other Russian officials. But what we do, as I mentioned before, is we have two processes. One on the left to build the database of relevant articles, from whatever that database. It could be EBSCO, it could be Integrum, it could be East-West, it could be your favorite corpus. It could be Google Scholar. I mean, it depends on whatever you want. We have different groupings of that. So we do different searches. We build very sophisticated queries to collect that, and then we begin to process them. And we use, in essence, 2 rounds of LLMs. One set of LLMs that are very broad and not fine. So they're not detailed, but they can pick up broad themes. So from those corpora, we want to run it once through that. Then we take a more refined LLM to extract more specific issues out of the corpus that are related to, in this case, red lines. So we then build taxonomies to allow that LLM to extract that, and then based on that, we then build a classifier and go from there. And so this is how we do the literal. And the literal red lines, again, we could use the search query through the Kremlin website to pick up the literal terms of red lines, but we also have used regex to extract it, and we came out with basically the same. So those are the 20 red line statements. Actually, there was another red line after this research on December 16th. So they're actually technically 21, but the analysis here is like 20. So that's how we do the literal ones. The real ones, as I mentioned, we go through this process of these 2 LLMs. And then what we do is we build a taxonomy that allows us to look more specifically at what's being said. So we build a classifier off of this taxonomy. And then we extract those real red line statements, the 280 or so statements that I mentioned. And this is just a plotting of the shaded is the literal terms, and the deep red is are the real red line statements. So you can see there's not a real good correlation between when Putin talks about them and literally and uses them more explicitly. And we did the same thing, by the way, with nuclear statements and built a taxonomy that then informed a classifier that we then used to extract those 47 statements from him. And then we plot those all over time and against other, you can take sort of more qualitative types of data, particular events like the lethal military assistance that the U.S. provided, or whatever else, other sanctions. So there are different timelines that you can use. And one of the interesting things here you see, so this has the literal red line statements and the nuclear threat statements, and you can see the one is that the two are not closely correlated. The patterns are rather interesting. You see, prior to the 2014-2021 period, you see more frequent but less intense application. And then you see, obviously, with 2022, more intense application. But again, as you'll see in a couple of other slides, the nuclear threat rhetoric is not correlated closely with the red line threat rhetoric. And so this just gives you a flavor of what the literal red line data is. So there are actually, if you go on the Kremlin website, you'll see there are about 60 statements out of 40 speeches, but not all of those are made by Putin. 20 of those are actually made by Putin, and primarily during 2013 and 2024. 70% of those statements have been made since 2021, since November of 2021. But most of the statements were made actually before the special military operation. So sort of late 2021, early 2022. So there's not been sort of a linear increase in red line threats. You see that most of them were actually concentrated during a 2022 and 2023 period. And only one reference prior to December 16th, 2024 in 2024. So again, it's not been a gradual ratcheting up of threats and a steady increase in literal references to red lines. So very sporadic and episodic. The targets have been quite varied and most of the time not even articulated. And most of the articulation, to the extent that targets have been identified, it's been obviously the US, NATO, and Ukraine. But you can see only 50% of the time. There's been a decline in some of the broader rhetoric surrounding red lines that are more, so those of you who studied Russian and those of you who studied Russian strategic behavior know that actually red line is somewhat of an alien concept. And as a result, that's not how they use other terms in Russian language to communicate, the escalatory nature to domestic audience. And we see those other terms have really been dropped since 2021. And so really, since the 2022, most of the messaging has been towards the external environment using the explicit, using the literal terminologies. What's really interesting is that, of course, there's been almost no explicit, very few explicit consequences, only really two that were referenced directed at Ukraine in 2020, June of 2021, and the US in November of 2021. And only one really explicit target, which was the Ukrainians' energy infrastructure and military command and control in that one articulation in March 2024. But the bottom line is there's no clear consequence that has been systematically articulated. But the most interesting thing is that there are very few clear lines that are articulated, right? And really those clear lines occurred prior to the special military operation. So if you go back to our articulation, right, while there's debate about the consequence, for a red line statement to exist, there has to be a line. And there's no line. Most of Putin's literal discourse about red lines are around, well, they're always asking me about the red lines, or they know what our red lines are, or they know what it is, or I'm not going to talk about our red lines, or all these things that are not about saying, don't do this, this is our red line, don't cross it, or else. So most of the rhetoric, the literal rhetoric is not about that. Does not specify consequences or even a line. And to the extent that there was any clear line, it's really been in a concentrated period right up to the actual use of force and prior to the declaration of a special military operation. So that's sort of the literal red lines. And also, by the way, they don't correlate with nuclear threat statements, right? There are no paragraphs where those 20 statements overlap with a nuclear reference. I mean, any nuclear reference, from nuclear modernization to nuclear energy to let alone nuclear deployments or a nuclear threat. There are only, out of the 13,000 or so documents, 14 of them where they're actually referenced even together in a document. And the references there are to nuclear are open-ended and very sporadic. And so when you look at this is plotting the nuclear statements and the literal red line statements. You see very little correlation between any of those. And when you look statistically, there's no correlation, significant correlation in these patterns. Okay, so what is it? How do we? What happens if we move off of the literal red lines and we look more at the real red lines? Well, what we did was, again, we wanted to not only extract those red line statements, but mesh them with other types of data, right? So a classic argument is that these threats are issued in response to the lethal military assistance work, right? So we took the DoD data and we looked just, and what I'm showing you is just the financial equivalent of what we've provided, the dollar packages. They're not particularly the systems, although we've done that too, and we see no correlation between moving from Javelins to F-16s. No consistent pattern. We've also used events data like ACLED, that allows us to look at specific types of Ukrainian explosions on Russian territory, or use of unmanned drones on Russia. We've also used broader events data, polecat data, that allows you to capture broader trends in coercion by the West or different countries directed at Russia to see if there's any kind of correlation. And you can use your preferred data sources. You can use the Institute Study of War operational data. We've played around with some of that. So, but just to give you a sense of this, so this is when you're using polecat. These are the types of coding that we captured. So coercion, manipulation, assault, and of course you can, this is the typology that we're using, but you can use a subset of that depending on what you want. But these are the types of codes that are embedded there. And this is just looking at the US, using all those codes, looking at the frequency of US events directed at Russia. And so you can see if you can vary over time in terms of the frequency. It also captures the intensity of those behaviors. So events data is an interesting way to paint a broader context of what's going on. Again, we use the DoD information. We've put those into spreadsheets and then we've plotted those. And then again, we've created a typology from ACLED events data, again, capturing different types of activities from protests to drone strikes by Ukraine. And again, plotting this kind of data. And, and so what you can get, and so what we've done in our research is we've looked to see if there's any patterns between any of these types of variables and either the frequency or intensity of the red line or nuclear threats. In other words, do these have any kind of correlation in terms of causing or driving the rhetoric? And then also we've looked at the rhetoric as an independent variable, whether or not the threats that Putin has made have been correlated with any kind of Western action. And so we are doing research on both fronts, but I'll just give you a flavor of a little bit of this before I turn it over. So this is plotting all of the events data, the different threat statements, the nuclear threats, and the literal and explicit ones. And so this is just plotting the DoD defense, lethal military assistance, and the real red line statements and the nuclear threat statements. And again, you see really no direct correlation between increases in the DoD lethal military assistance and those statements. In fact, you see almost an inverse relationship between those. And this, again, this is measuring the quantity and of the financial packages that we're providing. But again, we don't see any correlation between any of the qualitative upgrades in U.S. lethal military assistance. This is looking at the POLCAT data and looks at the intensities. So this last one looked at the frequencies of U.S. military assistance and the frequencies of those threat statements. This is looking at the intensities of it. And you also see almost an inverse relationship. As the more intense Western behavior almost suppressed the nuclear threat statements. And then as we've seen a reduction in the intensity, and this is the aggregate Western, this is US, Japanese, European, Ukrainian. So you can zero in each one of them to see if there's a more distinct pattern, but you don't see any real correlation. If anything, there's an inverse relationship. Oops, the wrong way. And then this is looking at the drone strikes, and it's almost the same thing. This is the blue line is Ukrainian drone strikes again in Russian territory. And you can see there's really been no correlation. If anything, again, as you see the blue line kind of move upwards, you see the threat, the intensity of the threat statements go down, and then as the number of attacks on Russia have gone down, you see a spike again in the threat statements. So there's sort of a disconnect here between the external action and the rhetoric, which all suggests, and this is actually something that we're playing with now. This is looking, the line is our Russian offensive actions, actually Russian explosions on Ukrainian territory, and the red line statements. And one of the things that we have been finding, which I don't want to present yet, but it is, so we're not seeing any correlation between Western action and the frequency or intensity of the red line statements, which when you think about it, right, if you're trying to deter something, you would expect to see, as we're taking more action, they're starting to say, don't do this or else, right? So you'd expect to see a correlation there. But we don't see that. What we have detected is that they tend to articulate, Putin tends to articulate his red line threats on the eve of and right after Russia takes its own aggressive action, which is more consistent with sort of a fait accompli kind of strategy as opposed to a classic deterrence one. So that's something we're actually probing right now. But the other thing that I wanted to show you is that this just captures what I just said. We don't see any clear correlation. But one of the things that we're doing now is saying, okay, we've looked at the content of what he said. We've looked at if there's any correlation. We haven't seen really any of that. But how can we understand the strategy, right? And so if we go back and we think about classic deterrence theory that says you want a clear line and clear consequence, right? We expect to see some consistency in the clarity of both of those things, or the different dimensionality of the threats and the consequences. With the threat that leaves something to chance, Schelling's manipulation of risk argument, we'd expect to see clear lines, but more inconsistency in terms of consequence. And with the reflexive control logic, right, which is all about manipulating the adversary, changing the adversary's frame, confusing the adversary, right? Getting the adversary to take action that Russia prefers without having to issue an explicit threat. So doing it covertly by manipulating how you see the world. It's more of an opportunistic rather than risky strategy aimed at confusing. So it's a little bit of throwing a lot of things at you and having you draw conclusions to paralyze you, to confound your behavior in manners that would be consistent with the Russian behavior. So we would expect to see inconsistency consistently applied, right? Inconsistent lines, inconsistent targets, inconsistent consequences. And so what we wanted to do then is, and this is sort of just dissecting the Russian way of war that I just mentioned, the reflexive control that's not about manipulating your cost-benefit calculation and probabilities. It's really about confusing you. It's about distorting your understanding of the landscape, of what's going on, to create a false picture, do things covertly, don't make explicit threats, right? What we wanted to do is then take an MRI, and this shows you, right? More classic Western would expect consistency, the threat that leaves something to chance would expect to see consistency about a line and about other dimensions, but not about the consequences, and then there'd be a lot more confusion with respect to reflexive control. And so what we've begun to do is, remember, we had this typology of the threats, and it allows us to break down the different elements of Putin's rhetoric in these real red line statements, and a code for how consistent, the darker color being the more inconsistent they are. And one of the things you see from this, without getting into the gory details, is that across multiple elements, from the clarity of the rhetoric, the targets, the lines, the consequences, whether or not it's unilateral versus multilateral action, all of these things, there's a tremendous amount of consistent confusion, right? There's a lot of inconsistency across all of those parameters, but especially with respect to lines, threats, right, themes, and interest, like what Russia's interest would be. And the same thing, although a slightly different picture, is these are the nuclear threats. And so you see a little bit more consistency in the discussion about nuclear threats. So the logic of nuclear threats seems to be a little bit different, maybe more like the shelling threat that leaves something to chance, where the red lines are not. But what's most interesting, in the period where they issued the most intense threats, it was the most confused, most inconsistent, right? Which would be more consistent with the kind of a reflexive control logic than with a threat that leaves something to chance. So all of this, let me just conclude by saying that, as again, this suggests that Putin's explicit, literal, right, red lines rhetoric, as well as the nuclear threat rhetoric, doesn't really match with a lot of what we think about when we talk about deterrence and our way of thinking about red lines, from the actual content of what he's saying to the coherence of what he's saying. We see very little correlation in terms of the timing with respect to the frequency and intensity of these threats and preceding Western action, from these particular hypotheses that from looking at DoD assistance to drone strikes to general aggressive behavior directed at Russia. So we see a lot of disconnect there. But I would also suggest that this also underscores the concerns about mirror imaging when we're doing our own research, and that even those who are steeped in deterrence, that we need to question some of our foundational concepts and how well they travel to others, which raises real questions about what happens when different strategies of deterrence bump up against each other, which may suggest there's more of a risk of inadvertent escalation, especially as both sides may be convinced of what they're doing and mirror image the other, and get it wrong. And so others have talked about more punctuated or wormhole types of escalation rather than linear, graduated escalatory processes. And the last thing is that I think this suggests that even for troglodytes like me in the social sciences, there's a real promise, I think, of using tools not to discern causal influence. I don't know that we're there yet, although I defer to others who are more steeped in this. But I think that these tools can help us identify, at minimum, the puzzles, the empirical landscape within which a lot of our analysis takes place, that can allow us to process a lot more data, to mesh data, to at least create a better understanding of the landscape, and to identify patterns that we then want to explicate, maybe using our more tried and true qualitative and quantitative methods. So one does not have to be a real proselytizer of data analytics to appreciate the real opportunity that it has for us to do both basic scholarly research as well as policy analytic research. So let me stop there.
Okay, thanks for the introduction to this, Adam. There's just so many different kind of avenues I would like to pursue. I'm going to ask just one question at the outset, and then we can open it up for more general questions and comments. What I'm curious about, because there's so many different kind of lines of research that one might pursue, is the degree to which your data is accessible to other parties? To what extent, are you interested in parties subscribing to your data sets? Is it publicly available? And if not, when might it be? To what extent are there publications already in the pipeline which kind of clarify in the fashion that you have today for a larger audience? Because it seems that there is, potential, tremendous value in what you have compiled. And I know you've invested, an awful lot of resources, both financially and in terms of, the power of different players, Georgia Tech and in the Netherlands and elsewhere. But I'm not aware of a lot of research that has been applied by other individuals making use of your material, the Minerva work or the work that Carnegie supported. So that's just, if you could give me a better sense of where that is and where it may be going. And then there are some other substantive questions that I have, but I'm going to defer those until others around the room and virtually have a chance to.
Right. So the first, I'll just, in general, when we spent time initially going down this route, we did it for our own to see if this would work. But increasingly, and with the generous support, especially from Carnegie, who was very early on, saw this as a real way to develop an architecture. So we don't have data. We do have data. We have the databases that I mentioned, but our whole mission is to make these tools available to others, and to allow people to use the data at their own fingertips. So we're actually data agnostic. We're at a university that has EBSCO. If you have EBSCO, you can, I can't share the corpora with you if you don't have EBSCO. But a lot of like what I just presented you was scraped from the Kremlin website. I can share all of that. In fact, we are. And Carnegie also supports George Washington. And George Washington's starting this new Russia program, where it's really designed to bring data analytics to the Russian area studies. And we're actually going to be sharing our open, non-proprietary data with them. So all of the data that I just showed you, we'll post there. We have tutorials on how to actually do all the different steps that I mentioned, from generating queries to then building your own corpora, to then developing LLMs to develop typology and classifiers, and then to develop those classifiers, put them onto embeddings, and then going after your own data sources. So we've designed tutorials, video tutorials. We are going to different workshops. So part of our funding has been to share how we've gone about doing this for others. Now we have, as part of our grants, we'd love to come and meet with people to do that, and then have them focus on some topics of mutual interests that relate to, some of the topics here, or outer space and Russia and China and the U.S. There's some of those fora, but we also are building videos, and so that we can get around the proprietary problem. People have, if you have access to EBSCO, we'll just show you how with the queries that we used, and you can go apply that to build your own data set. Or if you have your own data set, we can show you how to develop typologies and classifiers that you can then turn loose on your own data. So yes, we're trying to make this as open as possible. We are restricted in terms of being able to share all of the corpora that we have, but we have corpora that are just Google Scholar, so we can share that. We have corpora that are built from stuff that we've pulled from the Chinese literature that is actually non-proprietary, and we can share that. We have the website data. We have Telegram stuff that we can. So there's stuff like that, but the real value is that we can show you how to do this yourselves. And then in terms of the publications, yes, we've published some things. I've published some things on applying this to understanding sanctions, and if there was any kind of, or how do we understand the Russian response to sanctions. So I published several things from that, but we're in this that I presented here is will be in Journal of Strategic Studies, in a document that tries to look at how do we understand coercion today, and this is going to be using some new tools and trying to understand what happens when we relax the mirror imaging problem. So yes, so we're, and really over the next 2 years, we're going to be spending less time on developing tools, more time on working with others to extract meaningful insights. Because one of the real payoffs of these tools is that it can allow people that bring different perspectives to look at a common, empirical landscape and then get a better understanding qualitatively of what do they see, what's interesting in that. And then that we found, like we've had workshops in Finland and in Brussels, where we brought different people together to look at the similar, once everybody understands, like we've invited them to bring their own data to it. And so we can map the data and then try to begin to have a conversation about what's actually going on. And so there are a lot of different ways that we're sharing these things and where they're starting to come out. And there's more, one of the problems of publishing this stuff is a lot of our classic journals, international security, stuff, they're just not built for visuals, but they're increasingly getting better at them. There's some others, Journal of Strategic Studies, not necessarily, your Journal of Conflict Resolution or something like that has a lot of quantitative things, but this isn't quantitative, and that's the one thing that everybody needs to understand. And there's a tendency to group data analytics with quantitative methods, and we're not suggesting that. We're trying to show you how you can use tools to do better searches that you're already doing, right? Using data sources that you're already exploring, trying to mesh those data sources with other data sources to see patterns. And then we leave it up to you to use your favorite quantitative, qualitative, or potentially data analytic tool to extract causal inference. But we're trying to just make sure that people have a much broader empirical understanding of whatever the puzzle is that they're looking at, be it escalation or proliferation related risks, et cetera.
Good, that's very helpful. So, and I want to encourage, our students as well as our faculty and other folks to ask the questions. So I'm going to call on Jeffrey Nuff first, and you have Lauren who?
Yes, Grace online. Grace Smith has a question.
Okay, so go ahead, Jeff.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much, Adam. This was super rich and thought-provoking. My initial reaction to the pitch for the value of data analytics is sort of yes and no. So I think what you showed us on the one hand revealed some very interesting things that would not be obvious to somebody just taking a kind of classical qualitative approach. But I think it also can on the other hand obscure or bury some things that would be more obvious to somebody taking a more traditional approach. So I think your inference about reflexive control, which I quite agree with, I think that came from you because you are a experienced, well-trained
Right.
Area specialist that didn't come from the data. I think I agree with all of your top line conclusions, but I have a couple thoughts about how you might push further. So the inferences I'm taking away from your talk is that there's kind of a puzzle because there's an awful lot of rhetoric that doesn't seem backed up by action, which seems right to me. There's a surprising level of disconnect between the red line rhetoric and the nuclear threats, which I didn't expect. So that's an interesting finding. There's a lot of vagueness and incoherence in the language, which is interesting. And then you interpret that as it's designed for a purpose. And that purpose is, what we in the US would call information operations or information warfare, what the Russians call reflexive control. And I think that's right. I think that is, in fact, the primary purpose, and that helps solve a lot of the puzzle. We could think of what Russia's doing as having multiple purposes because there are multiple audiences. So the information campaign is sort of directed, I think, at NATO and the West broadly. Can you split apart the coalition in support of Ukraine by causing some of the countries to become so fearful of war with Russia that they back away from support for Ukraine? I think that is the number one Russian goal, and it explains a lot of what's going on. But I think they have two other audiences, and one is really more the U.S. specifically, and in that one, I think there are deterrent intentions behind what Russia's doing, and the one thing in the literature that you might play with some more, to me, is the calculated ambiguity stuff. I think more than shelling in the threat to leave something to chance, I think what Putin and Russia's doing is a version of the old calculated ambiguity. We might do something, we might not. It could end up nuclear, it could not. You know, you shouldn't probe too far. And if that's right, you could then anchor what I think is your very correct analysis about the danger of inadvertent escalation, you know, in Sagan's old notion of the commitment trap, that when you start issuing calculated threats, you back yourself into a corner where at a certain point, for the sake of credibility, you feel like you have to back them up. And I'm sure you're quite aware that there has been a lot of chatter inside Russia about maybe we really are going to need to act one of these days to prove that we mean it when we have our red lines and that we're true to the credibility. You know, the final audience, I think, is a domestic audience, right? That this is rhetoric as performance to show that Putin is still tough and still in control to a domestic Russian population that may have doubts about the war. And, you know, the hawkish rhetoric, helps maintain, you know, Putin's image at home. So I agree with everything you said, but I think there's ways in which you could keep going further with it.
So let me just throw back, I agree with everything you said, but just to clarify a couple of things. In terms of the multiple audiences, so one of the things you can do with these tools to get at that is to look at like the events data. You know, events data is like what set of entities, it could be a country, it could be a company, it could be a, you know, whatever that entity is, directed at another entity, and then there are different types of verbs, you know, different types of actions that you can look at. So you can actually disaggregate what either, if there's a correlation between Putin's rhetoric, the intensity, the frequency of his rhetoric, and what we're doing versus what Europe is doing. And so we actually did that, and we don't see any correlation there either. So it's really, but you can do that with these tools. Similarly, on the domestic side, what you can do with some events data, not PolCap, but other events data, you can only look at different source material. So you can only look at like Russian language periodicals and then compare that with non-Russian language periodicals that capture the reporting about Russia to see if there's a different message that's being communicated to the, you know, to one audience versus another audience. And again, what we did in this one is you know, once we saw these patterns and with the literal statements, which were only 20 of them, we actually had a different group of Russian scholars look at these and to say, like, when just reading this, what did you get out of it? And so early, as I mentioned, up to 2021, there were other terms in there that convey, because krasная linia, krasная черта are not, they're not natural. That's not how you're really going to grab a Russian audience that thinks like this. But there are other terminologies, other constructions that were suggestive of maybe speaking to the domestic audience. But then that kind of discourse seemed to drop out. And of course, we're looking at the Kremlin website, which is probably more oriented towards the, you know, out facing as well. So, but there are ways of using these tools and that to get at exactly what you're talking about. Calculated, and so you're exactly right. And I started this, and my colleague Stefan just beat me up about it because, you know, I'm studying the Russian military, and I always thought we've been mirror imaging because I, of course, think Russia does something else. So I brought my priors to it, and he kept saying, let's get empirical about it. Let's get empirical about this. And I just couldn't get away from it until those last set of slides. Because those last set of slides to me show the promise of, like, if you do your typologies right, you disaggregate different components of what a red line is. And by the way, we pick red lines because red lines are the most explicit form of deterrence, right? So if you're going to issue a red line, it really is about credibility being at the crux of that. And so, but if you start doing an MRI, you can begin, and I gave you our way of doing it, but there are other ways of doing it to try to actually get, is this calculated ambiguity? Or is this really a reflexive control that's like all over the place? Or is it really the threat that leaves something to chance? That's actually where we are right now, is trying to use these tools to get at that, rather than do what you rightfully pointed out, and which I'm always trying to harness myself. But what we're doing in these projects is actually I don't want, empirics by themselves don't mean much to me. And I guess that's because I was steeped at UCLA and beat up by, we need to look at things through heuristics and test these heuristics. And so I'm trying to make sense out of these patterns. What's fascinating to me is when we see patterns that don't make sense out of the extant, heuristics out there. And then that warrants really, sort of doing things. And we've seen a couple of those, especially when it came to sanctions, where there was really, it was not a reciprocal, and we frankly called the Russian responses reciprocal sanctions, but their behavior was not really reciprocal, it was orthogonal. We saw a correlation between, we slapped sanctions, the Europeans slapped sanctions, they practiced coercion, but in a completely different area, like Syria, right? Or other things. So it was so using these tools allowed you the combination of meshing different data, relaxing some of your heuristics and looking for patterns, then seeing what makes sense or what doesn't make sense allows us to kind of get to where you are. So that's why I'm like you, I see the glass actually less half empty and half full. I mean, I'm now seeing increasing the promise of these tools to allow us to refine our thinking on the heuristic side and then testing them the way we normally test them. I've not had so much of the Kool-Aid to think that we can do this automatic. But there are others out there, and my colleague is much more bullish on the promise of these.
Good. Thanks so much for the exchange here. So we have, I think, Grace and then Jim Lamson. So why don't we take those two questions together and then let Adam respond. So Grace, would you like to?
Grace said, thank you for this fascinating presentation and your extensive research. Excuse me for typing rather than speaking. I can't seem to get a sentence out without coughing right now. My question, are we assuming Putin's signaling is aimed exclusively externally at us or for the international community? What I'm wondering is, what if he's trying to bolster domestic support by showing that his red lines are connected to aggressive action, which would please those Russians who want a strong leader, who want to feel like Russia is a superpower on the world stage, who are done feeling humiliation. Have you tried or would you consider studying if these events, Putin articulates red line statements on the eve of or directly after Russian aggressive action, are correlated with indicators of domestic support?
Okay.
Pожалуйста. Yes, I mean, I
think you already kind of touched on much of that just because of the sequence of the questions and answers. So thank you, Grace, for the question. And if you want later to return to that, fine. So Jim, you're up.
Yeah, thanks so much, Bill.
First, thanks very much for a very useful presentation. Among other things, we're conducting a project on Iran's approach to coercion. So this is very useful in helping us think about our work on Iran. So 2 quick questions. One, do you see any difference or can you distinguish at all, or is it useful to distinguish at all, between Russian coercive threats that are initiatory versus responsive, including the use of stated red lines, especially if one views Russia's approach to coercion as a blend of deterrence and compellence, like Adamski and others have claimed? Or have all Russian stated threats been responsive? I mean, that is triggered by others' policies or actions and not necessarily initiatory. And the second one, question, have you seen any useful distinction between Russia's use of coercive threats, including red lines, that are setting red lines in general versus setting red lines during a specific immediate crisis or specific scenario or a specific point in time? That is kind of like the distinction that we talk about in deterrence of, between general deterrence and immediate deterrence. Or is it just perhaps not useful to try to distinguish between, Russian statements that are intended as general deterrence versus immediate deterrence? Thanks very much.
Thank you, Jim.
Okay, so on the first question, as Bill mentioned, I think I touched on most of it, but I do think you're exactly right. Let's test that. Let's test those hypotheses. I think what our research suggests, and this gets to Jim's point, is that we see the red line statements less reactive and more initiatory. In other words, there's more of an endogenous motivation for them rather than an exogenous specific threat that they're responding to. But your point about general versus immediate is well taken, because you do see sort of in the data some clusters of the articulation, both the literal and the real red lines, that may be suggestive that there's more of a general approach. But again, I'm not sure if that is generated by external response to, external action, or it has to do with some other way that they're calculating the war effort. And I think the tools that we're using allow us to see if there are, and again, and even some of the data I showed you, very specific things like Ukrainian drone strikes, or more generic patterns and trends like in coercive behavior that the events data allow you to do. So I think you can probably get at that. We just haven't really seen any correlation between those things, but that doesn't mean that they're not driven by some sort of internal logic about sort of an immediate conception of deterrence. The last thing I would say to Jim, you should definitely read Dima's most recent piece, and actually I think it's going to be coming out in this Journal of Strategic Studies, where he talks about the differences between Chinese, Russian, and Iranian conceptions of coercion, where he tries to distinguish some of these, the different logics. So if you found his writing compelling on Russia, I urge you to look at this. He's also looked at Hamas and Hezbollah too. So, look for those.
When we want this journal, it
I
should be
know,
out.
good question. I'm a day late already. I don't know when it's going to come out, but we're due, sometime hopefully.
This is a special
2025.
edition?
Yeah, special
Okay,
issue.
great. Okay, Glenn?
Thanks for a really fascinating talk and very, very provocative in many ways. Having lived through all those, area studies versus kinds of arguments from decades ago. But I do have sort of two questions about how you are drawing conclusions or tentative conclusions based on this model, not model, but methodological approach. The first question has to do with conclusions about the coherence of the red line statements. The data seems to suggest that it really is incoherent, at least if we're doing the mirror imaging and expecting them to do it like us. There's kind of no rhyme or reason to these red line statements, if I understood the data correctly. Or you could conclude that it is coherent, but within a different framework, the Russian way of war, kind of this type of approach, sort of a Clifford Geertz local knowledge or something like that. So the first question is, so which is it in your judgment? Is it really kind of incoherent as the data suggests, or that data suggests, or is it red line statements much more coherent, but within this kind of very different framework that would need to be built up, I suspect. The second is, again, if I understood the data, there were a lot of red line statements, particularly by Putin himself, on the eve of the February 2022 invasion, and sort of in the immediate aftermath of that, and some here and there. But over the last 8-10 months or so, there's been a drop-off significantly. Again, the question is, so what do we conclude from that? Can we conclude that Putin and others just thought these red line statements were not useful, and so they've just kind of mostly done away with them in a way that they were using them more heavily a couple of years ago? Or does it reflect on the very sort of opposite side, a confidence that, well, they've served their purpose, they've done what we wanted them to do, now we're in a much stronger position in Ukraine, so we don't need to do this, at least not do it as much. So there seems to be two pretty different conclusions one can draw on that. So,
Right.
thank you.
No, thank you. Thanks for all of those things. So, in terms of the first question about, is this coherent or is it not coherent? I mean, that's the real purpose of doing the MRI. And I think that what we see, and maybe I didn't convey it clear enough, is that here is, in the red line stuff, it strikes us like purposefully inconsistent. I mean, it's just, they go out of their way, even use literal terms of red line. Putin uses the terms red lines, and he uses red line-like threats, 280 some odd times. So I do think there's a purpose to it. But it's very ambiguous on all fronts. That is distinguished from the nuclear threat literature that seems to be a little bit more coherent, except in one period, which happened to be the most intense period of usage. But it does seem like the logic of behind the nuclear threats may be different than the logic behind the red line threats, where I think overall, and when you put them together, it seems like, from my understanding, more consistent with the reflexive control. But that may be, and this gets to a bigger set of questions, that the war to date has really not been about nuclear. It's not been a nuclear crisis. That doesn't mean we can't get into a nuclear crisis. And we see that when they even are talking about nuclear issues, they're talking, the strategy, the logic seems to be different than the red line stuff. So that would be how I do. Now, what do we see? So one of the things, this is where I'm going over my skis beyond sort of the data, but one of the things that I've been struck by is, again, the last time he literally used the term red lines was in March of 2024. Actually, he did use it in a meeting in December. But what has happened is the coherence of his articulation has really increased, especially since late August and certainly in September and October and November. In other words, he gave a very, very clear response to the ATACM issue, right? And where there was actually very clear logic that he was making. He's like, you guys are manning the navigation and guidance of it. If they use those systems to hit our territory, then you are directly involved in this, and therefore, blah, blah, blah. And then he's modified the nuclear doctrine and all this other stuff. But that's a much more coherent, whether or not you agree with it is another thing. But there is a shift in the tenor of the coherence, at least, of the rhetoric, which that's something to look forward to. So I'm always hesitant about like predicting everything. And we're not saying these are hollow threats. In fact, we see coherence, but it's operating according to a different logic. And that logic may vary between the general red line threats and the nuclear dimension. The more they start talking about nuclear, well, our research says, well, there's a logic there, then that logic may be consistent with the threat that leaves something to chance kind of arguments. So to the extent that we maybe transition, and the other signal would be, how do they talk about this war? Well, they talk, initially they're talking about it as a local war. Well, when you look at the doctrine, right, nuclear weapons are not correlated with a local war. When they start using regional war, global war in their characterization of the war, well, that may be suggestive that we're getting into another context. So, I leave it to others to try to, this is what I think the challenge for all of us moving forward is to try to understand this. So I do see differences in the logics. I do see logics. I see the differences in logics. I see that there's a change in the quality of the coherence of what he's saying, especially with the ATACMs. They're surprisingly not so much with the Kursk incursion, but really more about the threat of long-range attacks. So we got to be careful not to draw too many inferences from the past and maybe being hollow in a different context than what we are now.
Thank you.
So I think I'm going to wrap up here at this time, but I do want to ask Jeff you a question before we proceed here, because I had the opportunity quite some time ago when Adam and Stefan were just kind of initiating this project to take a peek at what they were trying to do. And I was more skeptical at that moment in time because we were kind of looking at it through the lens of non-proliferation and what you were able to generate at that moment in time. But you've come a very, very long way. And so I really want to congratulate you and your team in what you're doing, because I think that there's tremendous potential to utilize this for a variety of different research topics. And I think there's a pedagogical value in understanding the kind of the methodology and the critique of the methodology, some of the questions which have come up in our discussion today. But Jeff, do we have through Middlebury access to the EBSCO collection? We do, so that shouldn't be an obstacle for us to, that's what I just wanted to,
Yeah, we have EBSCO host. I think we have ProQuest.
the ProQuest law, the standard database.
A lot of these things would be on the library.
Okay, that's
website.
reassuring.
I mean, we'd be happy to come out sometime and do a workshop and show people how to actually do this, and you bring your own data and your own questions, and you can then see how to do this. I mean, that's what we're doing in different places, with different communities in the Russian, strategic.
Yeah, well, I think that would be interesting also as we develop our own work in the China
Yeah,
sector.
definitely,
So
China.
let's definitely think about doing this. Well, this was a fascinating seminar. I'm so glad that you came out to give it, Adam, and please join me in expressing our great appreciation to Dr.